Dear guests, welcome. Also on my behalf, dear Bruno, pleasure to have you here. It's always a festive occasion, book launch. This is a book, World Builders, which you already wanted to write as a child, as you say in the dedication. Now, since those days, you have changed a lot, the world has changed a lot. And you're decrypting that in the book, which makes fascinating links between the technology wars started by Trump, China's attempt to build a new world system, the pandemic, war in Ukraine, climate crisis as well. And it's very refreshing for us here in Brussels to think about the world not in terms of silos, but to tie it all together in a strategic story. Now, as many here know, but good to point out, you're a political philosopher by training with a PhD from Harvard. You have taught in Seoul, in Berlin, worked in Beijing as well, at the university there. As Margot already said, you were Secretary of State for European Affairs of Portugal during the Eurozone crisis, which is when you and I first met, in fact. But then you started a career as author and analyst, two important books back in 2018, Dawn of Eurasia, Belt and Road, which is kind of the breakthrough of you as author, and other books have followed, like Geopolitics for the End Times. Not to forget that you also wear other hats as consultant and as foreign correspondent for the New Statesman, in which capacity you've also reported from Ukraine and many other places. Now, this book, dear guests, I will not be able to sum it up briefly. It is, just as your CV is rich, a lot of it comes together in this book. It's ambitious as an essay, it's bold and subtle at the same time in its argumentation. I think your ambition basically was to write a philosophy of history for our age, kind of from Hegel to who are I and back again. And frankly, for me, it was an intellectual feast, so very pleased to be talking with you about it. Now, your main thesis is that the struggle for supremacy is no longer so much about geographically territorial issues, but has become technological. It's about rules and policies and technological standards. And of course, to conclude, the current context makes this even more relevant with the war in Ukraine on the one hand, which of course still is about territory, but also shows us that anything basically can be weaponized, energy, cyberspace, infrastructure, technology. And of course also with now Trump 2.0 administration, and you've written a book before, but we'll also have to talk about, of course, what's happening next with this alliance also between Trump, Vance, and Musk, giving Elon Musk a great platform for his views on AI, and with Vance out there, and many will remember only last month at the big Paris AI summit, basically derailing against any form of regulation for the US vision on that. So that's a bit of the background. Now, to get us all going, maybe let's simply start with the title, intriguing, World Builders, people who make the world, because they set the rules. The era, I think that's your thesis, the era of universally acknowledged rules is over. Yeah. You take your bit of the start of your book from the Huawei 5G story back in 2018. Maybe for you, who are the world builders? Are we talking about private actors, state actors, both? And also, what is their game?
They are states. They are the major states, and they are what I call in the book superpowers. The difference between a superpower and a regular power is that the superpower is building the world within which every other state has to act and operate. The book, as you say, is quite ambitious. Whether it's a good or a bad book, I don't know, but I wanted it to be very ambitious. And let me just very quickly tell you why I wanted to write this kind of book. It's a big theory that has the ambition of explaining everything. You can describe the theory in 2 sentences, and then those 2 sentences are supposed to explain anything that you can think of. It's that kind of book, which I'm sometimes very suspicious when I read them, but that's the thing about writers. What you don't like in others, you're very glad to do yourself. But particularly when I started to do a lot of journalism, writing columns every week and doing reporting, I had this sense that a lot of times I was just making stuff up. Had to come up with a position on what happened last week, or come up with a position on what is happening now. And so I felt the need to stop and have a theory that could give me some grounding and that would provide some coherence to the opinions that I had to formulate all the time. That is the initial impetus for the book. Then there were things happening that I thought were quite intriguing. I tend to trace this book back to 2018, when I started hearing a lot, particularly in Washington. I spent a few months there in 2018. And there was this sentence always repeated that the world is about to become Chinese. People were very scared that the world would become Chinese. And I thought, this seemed to be very normal in the DC think tanks. But, as a political philosopher, I thought it was a very intriguing sentence. Because in my naivete, I thought the world was a physical entity, or a metaphysical entity, or a God-given entity, but not a Chinese-given entity, that the world is outside. Geopolitics, by the way, when it was first devised at the beginning of the 20th century, was precisely meant to be a scientific theory that oscillated between geophysics, geography, biology, but it was placed in that general scientific area. And so it was the opposite of what we now intend by geopolitics, where the physical world has absolutely no existence. It's created, and it can be created by China, and then it is a Chinese world, or it can be created by the United States, and it's an American world. I interpret that sentence, the world is about to become Chinese, as meaning it's about to stop being American and becoming Chinese, but it's already American. And finally, the third thought that is behind this book is this. I think we're now at a moment of transition, a moment of transition from one kind of order to a different kind of order. And these moments of transition are moments when people tend to realize that there's nothing fixed about the global order. There's nothing eternal. It's always changing. 2 authors that describe this very well, and they happen to be 2 of my favorite authors, and they were authors I like to read at 15, at 30, at 45, as opposed to many that only seemed interesting at one point. Toynbee and Ibn Khaldun, the North African historian, political philosopher, 14th century. What they have in common is this very acute sense that there is no end to history. They are the anti-Fukuyama thinkers par excellence. There's no end to history. We always have new constructs being developed, and we will always have new constructs while there is a planet Earth and while there is humanity. That seems very obvious too, but what I thought was interesting was, well, if there are always new orders being created, can't we think of global order as being about the general framework that provides some kind of intelligibility to the process by which new orders are created? So instead of trying to build world order on some set of ideas or some set of beliefs that are considered to be eternal, let's abandon that naive belief in anything eternal. And let's create a world order that provides a very high-level general framework for the succession of sets of beliefs, for the succession of world orders. Let's not build a world order. Let's build the framework for infinite world orders. And that's the idea of world builders. There are agents that are trying to build global order. And is there some kind of framework that can make this more rational, that can make this more ordered, that can make this, instead of being decided by wars, instead of being decided by chance, that we can create some principles? And the book tries to suggest what are the ordering principles to this infinite process of succession and historical change. By the way, because I know you want me to mention Hegel, it's quite striking when you read Hegel that for all his attentiveness to change, to historical change, to the dialectic, to the process by which every stable order creates the conditions for its own undermining, which is also very present in Ibn Khaldun, but it's present in Hegel. He ends up believing that there is a set of ideas that are final.
Well, yeah, he is, of course, the godfather of the end of history, Hegel. So, yeah. Well, I think that's a great start of the general structure of the book. But if we now look at this moment of transition of the two main state actors of the story, the US and China, which you describe as empires, the US also as an empire, and maybe the moment of transition is also precisely the moment when it becomes visible also to the Americans themselves that they are an empire. That is something you suggest, because, well, Bruno writes, funnily, that the US behaves like an empire, talks like an empire, acts like an empire, but denies that it is an empire because of its universality and a strong conviction of its own exceptionalism. And here, I guess, but correct me if I understood you wrongly, the technology comes in, because it's precisely technology and the fact that after 1945, the US has been able to create this one world thanks to its invisible technology, its economic power, which made that its own imperiality, as it were, invisible. The question then is, well, where do we go next? Huh? And also whether, that's more or less a correct summary of what you're trying to say, and where we go next, because as I already mentioned at the outset, you've finished this book, obviously, well, shortly, I presume, before the 5th of November. A lot of the trends have been going on, but with Trump back in the White House, how do you see that story unfolding?
I see a story about a system, the American system. This is the American form of power, which I think is historically new. And in fact, sort of my book would start with the American empire, because it's the first empire that is fundamentally about creating a world within which other states have to live, the American world.
So the Americans are the first world builders in your sense? That's right.
The first to have a consciousness that this can be done. And, America created a system, created an American world, an American century. And now the question today is whether that is coming to an end. I see a number of developments. On the one hand, we see Russia that tries to destroy that system. And in fact, what I argue in the book is that Putin's Russia is an attempt to return to a kind of natural, physical, geopolitical world in the old sense of geopolitics. Grounded in a kind of physical, biological reality. And you see these theories all the time in Russia. And if you want to read an author that is particularly influential in Russia, but particularly good at developing these theories, it's Gumilev. And apparently Putin's favorite writer, not by coincidence. Then we have China, which I think is what is fascinating about China is, in fact, the way it's so different from Russia. China is not destroying a system. China is building a new system, in many respects, on top of the American system. Like, imagine a city, and there's a new city slowly being built on top to replace it. And then maybe some ruins of the American world in the new Chinese world, some parts of the American world that are retrofit or renovated to serve new purposes in the Chinese world. And that was already my theory in my book on the Belt and Road. And then on top of these two developments, we have Donald Trump, which is particularly fascinating because I think he represents the moment when America itself starts to destroy the system it built, because Donald Trump thinks that the system is actually not working in America's favor. He may well be right about this. Where I think it's easier to criticize him is on the point that instead of building a new system, or instead of changing the existing American system, he seems to be joining Putin's Russia in the attempt to return to a kind of a natural world of brute force. I strongly believe, as a matter of political philosophy, that the best form of power is systemic power. That the best form of power is the power you exert almost invisibly by creating the structural conditions that determine everyone else's actions. So I'm just thinking of an analogy now that may not be very good, but you have a little mouse, and instead of moving the mouse using your brute force, you create a maze that has only one exit, and the mouse is predetermined to take the path that you chose for it. To be very blunt, this is how I think America has exercised power for 100 years. It has created a system where the outcomes were to a considerable extent predetermined by finance, by currency, by energy, by ideas, by soft power, by a global network that we call the American system. I think, as I say at the beginning of the book, a number of developments could invalidate my thesis. One development that would invalidate it would be that if China gave up on the idea of creating an alternative system.
What could they do instead?
War. War is the traditional way to replace an hegemonic power. You have what is called an hegemonic war. You win that war, you become the new superpower, the new hegemonic power. I've never seen China taking this path. They could take it if they decided that the alternative path is utopian, unrealistic. The alternative path is to build a world of finance, of infrastructure, of trade, of currency.
But how do you think they are doing? I mean, you spend still a lot of time in China as well. You travel, you have your contacts. The ambition is in place, it seems. Yeah. So with these two main actors, how do you see the outcome? If we can speak in a credible way about this, of course, but
well, the outcome,
as your book is about everything, we might as well
yes
go into the future as well.
The outcome, because in the book I compare this process to building a video game.
Yes.
The outcome is not determined in the sense that it depends on how good, how strategic, how disciplined the two main actors for the time being are. I have to say that for the time being, if I want to detect a trend, I see more discipline and more awareness of the final goal on the Chinese side than on the American side, particularly when I see Donald Trump so interested in bringing down the system and so completely incapable of understanding the nature of systemic power. Because the thing about Trump is that he understands that if you exert power in a direct way, using brute force or blackmail or the kinds of direct force, in the very short term, it works very, very well. If you're the United States and you have the kind of power the United States has, you can see it every day. And people say, well, he's winning because, the Canadian governor of Ontario just withdraw the tariffs. Zelensky had to go along with Trump. And you say, well, Trump is winning. Yes, in the short term, he's winning. But this, in the long term, and even in the medium term, does not work because it creates enormous resistance, because it consumes an enormous amount of resources. If I look to the Cold War, I see a story of two forms of power: systemic power on the American side and a kind of direct power on the Soviet side, which in the end didn't work. And if America now decides to mimic the Soviet Union and use that kind of direct power, with all the differences that there exist, but in any case, their conceptions of power, then I don't think things are going well in that particular competition. And I do see China extremely disciplined. Every news that comes from Beijing points in that direction. I tend not to be very surprised because, again, it seems to fit with this general orientation. But for example, when DeepSeek appeared, what did you see? That they made it open source. Why do they make it open source? Because they want their technology to spread globally. And if the short term you don't win a lot, this is not about the short term, it's about the long term. I happened to be in India when DeepSeek was launched, and remarkably, the entrepreneurs in Bangalore were downloading DeepSeek to their own machines, which you can do, and DeepSeek doesn't stop you from doing that. And then there's no problem of data security because nothing goes to China. The whole model is downloaded to your computer. You can do it for $6,000. You can have the whole DeepSeek model running in your computer. But in the end, Indian entrepreneurs are using Chinese tech. China is growing in prestige. When Chinese tech becomes global, worldwide accepted, then you have a lot of power to draw benefits from that, but it is a long-term process. Mm-hmm. And by the way, the American companies are doing the opposite, are making this technology so expensive and so proprietary that no one in India will use it. They can't. So I don't know the outcome, but you sort of the trend lines. That's how I see them.
Very clear. Taking you up again on this point of technology and also the relationship to geography and territory, because as I said at the beginning, your thesis is, as you put it in the chapter, The Age of Geography, about the Ukraine war. Geopolitics is the struggle not to control territory but to create it, and it's about technology. But we are here at the Brussels Institute for Geopolitics, so we part in a way even as a place of this return of geopolitics after decades when political thinkers and diplomats spoke in terms of international relations. But the twist you want to give to this story is to say that this prefix geo is not about geography in the old sense, but it's really about the technology. But I want to quiz you a little bit on that, on the interaction between the material side of the virtual world and the sea cables and the energy needed and all the rest of it, and the virtual side. How do you see that interaction play out? Because there you don't write that much about because you focus really on the virtual side. But how do you see that material?
Yes, I suspect if you read the book, maybe you'll also be tempted to disagree with me on this point. I really go all the way, let us say, in devaluing the physical world in the book. And I even ended the book talking about the possibility of virtual energy that is not rooted in physical reality, and the book becomes quite metaphysical at that point. I devalue the idea that critical minerals, are important. I argue that they're not really very important because there are so many critical minerals that can be used. 1 month it's cobalt, the other month is lithium, there may be others. We seem to have entered a different world where the scarcity of the physical world is not the determinant variable, and that's a very significant difference between fossil fuels and the new sources of energy. And I think there have been signs in this direction. You hear all the time about discoveries of new minerals, and this is not going to be an obstacle. I think it's quite deceptive, and I made that mistake in my previous book and frankly admit it. When I see the European Union become too fixated on this, it's not about controlling critical minerals, it's about what you do with them. And if China wins the competition, it's not going to be because they control critical minerals, but because they were first in using them at scale, like they are doing with electrical vehicles and with solar panels. In the end, I don't think this is decisive. I think the most powerful counter-argument is Ukraine.
Well, I was going to bring that in, of course, because indeed, as I said, you reported yourself from Ukraine. It's classic First World War fight about square kilometers, about tiny villages, a few houses where hundreds of soldiers die on both sides. So it's very grounded. I know there's the technological side and the drones and Starlink and Elon Musk popping in as well, and so it all tied together. But still, there is the contest about the space, the square kilometers.
I'm not sure this is where things are decided, as I say in the book. I do say it at the beginning, and this was one of the reviewers. I mean, reviewers are not completely useless, and because it's an academic press, I had to go through that process, and one of the reviewers said, I think it was a helpful suggestion, how about you give a couple of examples of things that would invalidate your thesis? And, it's China, which I already mentioned, and then Ukraine. Is the Ukraine war being decided in the battlefields of Donbass? Now, I think this is a relatively painful discussion to have, and I also say that in the book, because on the one hand, we have to admire the bravery of the individual soldier. Not just the bravery, but the endurance. What you see is not just bravery, but the endurance of being in those fields during the long winters, in the trenches, fighting for a cause. But is this where the war is being decided? I didn't think so when I wrote the book, and I think events of the last few weeks seem to show this. It's not in the battlefield of Donbass that the war is being decided, where in fact very little has happened for a year or more, but it's at the genuinely global level, and it's at the level of global geopolitics, and particularly it's at the level of the global system. I tend to think, until being convinced otherwise, that the decisive factors were directly connected with, on the one hand, currency, the way Russia was able to isolate itself from global financial forces. There were no bank runs. Putin spent 10 years doing this. He was quite successful. His army turned out to be much weaker than we thought, but his economic infrastructure turned out to be much stronger than we thought. Joe Biden is on the record 2 days after the invasion saying this will be economic Armageddon for Russia. It wasn't.
That's what the Europeans also said when we were going to do the sanctions.
That's right.
Same language.
I don't know if everyone believed it or not. Clearly there were some illusions about how strong the Western or American-led system is, particularly how global it is, because what happened was that China, Indonesia, and India continued to import Russian energy. This is not the world of 1980. These three countries together are enough to keep Russian exports going. Why didn't the United States try to stop some of these exports? Maybe China would not be possible, but Indonesia and India might have been. But why not? We all know the answer, because at this point they can't afford to push Indonesia and India into China's arms. So it's in the structural weakness of the system that the root causes lie, and that's why, in fact, Russia is still fighting after 3 years and will be able to fight another 3, because if their main source of income, energy exports, has not been affected, in fact, they're exporting more than before the war started, and to other parts of the world. If Europe and the United States, in fact, even want Russia to continue exporting its energy, because that's the way to keep energy prices low, and we don't think we can afford higher energy prices, both politically and economically, I think these are the determinant variables. And this ultimately is why we're not talking about the possibility of Ukraine losing a lot of its territory. And I fear, maybe this is not the moment to discuss this, or maybe it is, but looking at developments now, I say this with great sorrow, but I see us on the way towards a semi-sovereign Ukraine. I don't see how that outcome will in fact be avoided, given the current variables. And so unfortunately, that would be a Russian victory. And I think on the battlefield, it was a different story. But this is not where the war was being decided all along.
Well, that's a compelling case for this counter-argument. And Indeed, we'll see how it will play out in the next few years. This story.
Or few days. We know.
Well, yeah, there's different
timelines.
Timelines, indeed. Bruno, maybe to conclude this part of our conversation on Europe, what role do you see for Europe in this world of world builders? What part can we play? Because of course here also, and many people in the room in their daily lives feel the heat of the technology wars between the US and China. So what cards does Europe have to play? Somewhere in your book, I don't remember where, but you mentioned like 3 options that the smaller actors have. You can be a nimble adjuster or adapter, like Switzerland, where you accept existing rules and you just make the most of it. Or you can be, I think you call it something like a domain specialist.
Right.
Like Russia, you specialize in one field, energy, fossil fuels. Or you can do the usual UK thing and you align and team up with one of the superpowers, helping them, helping yourself for your favorite set of rules to remain dominant. So what should Europe do? Or is there still maybe also for Europe the possibility of creating our own, not rules, but our own world?
Yes. So, I wanted this framework of world building to be, in fact, quite democratic. And I think it can be, even though you start with this premise that there are giant powers that are building worlds for everyone else. It happens first that these worlds, as built by the superpowers, are rather general, and they're composed of a number of rules, processes, institutions. But there's still a lot of space to build more complexity at the regional and local level. So that could be something that the European Union could do, but it would be a modest role. It would be to add complexity at the local level to the general program that is determined by China or the United States. I also think that this general program by which the world is governed can be, as software developers call it, composable. Parts of it, percentages of it could be designed and built by different actors. So the European Union could have a role in building global trade rules, but it wouldn't have a role building global energy rules. This is the domain specialist. Now,
and we don't get the God mode of
we don't get full power of the system, and we're always under threat of being replaced in that regional domain because those that build the global structure always have more structural power. We could, as you say, just play the game that others have built. It's a quite remarkable feature of our world and of the past few decades that some countries that didn't build the rules are more successful at playing the game than those that built them. And this is, in fact, I think explains a lot of...
Thinking of?
Singapore or Switzerland, they're more successful at playing the game that America has built than America is, at least in terms of socio-economic advancement, standard of living, and prosperity, security, and so on. I think, in the end, I think many Europeans would be disappointed by the roles I've just described. And I think if any European accepts this framework, they would want to be world builders too. Now, the question here is whether this is possible. I think because we are in this moment of transition, I think the possibility of radical surprises and processes that accelerate and take very unexpected turns is all around us. I just gave a talk yesterday to some finance people, and all of them were stunned, and these are professionals. They were stunned at how fast they went 3 weeks ago from thinking that China and Europe were going to be in recession and the US would have a booming economy, to now thinking that the US will be in recession and China and Europe is where they should be investing. Okay, this is good news for Europe, and I think there are more good news. I'm convinced myself that it's going to be a blasphemy to say this in these hallowed grounds, but I'm convinced that Europe's biggest problem is our dependence on the US. And it's even our biggest economic problem. We lost the internet economy because 20, 25 years ago, we were convinced that it was exactly the same to have an American Amazon, an American Facebook, or a European Facebook, or a European Amazon. And I remember people did say this. They might now deny it, but they did say that it didn't matter. And so it didn't happen by chance. It wasn't because of excessive regulation. Sorry, Mr. Draghi. It wasn't because the EU needs institutional reforms. It was because we're too comfortable in our position of dependence on the US. And so I do expect that now with Donald Trump and a number of other developments, we are going to be choosing a different path of independence, as Friedrich Merz says, and all power to him. And I think if we go down this path, even our economic possibilities will be surprisingly expanded, and it could be quickly. Already we see that the first 2 months of the year, European stock market is doing better. Why is it doing better, by the way? Because people are expecting massive investments, and particularly in defense. And the defense index with the 10 most important defense companies in Europe, Leonardo, Rheinmetall, Airbus, and a few others, is doing better than the Magnificent Seven with Meta, Alphabet, Nvidia, Tesla, and so on. And it's not a coincidence. It's because there seems to be a consciousness that it's a new time for Europe. So I think, hopefully, I'll finish in 2 sentences. Hopefully, there will be now a feedback process by which decision makers in this city and other capitals realize that by taking bold steps, they can be rewarded with new opportunities rather than new risks. Because I think the mindset is still, if we take bold steps in terms of our strategic independence, we're going to be punished by higher risks. And there's no awareness that we're also going to be rewarded by opportunities that we didn't think about. Who thought that our stock markets would be doing better than the American stock market? And so if we enter this process by which bold decisions are followed by rewards, and rewards encourage new bold decisions, then things could start happening.
Thank you so much for ending on such a positive note. That history is still open.
Yeah.
There can be positive surprises. Thank you for your book. We continue this conversation with our 2 other guests, whom I'd now like to invite on the stage as well, which we're going to do a little reshuffle. Ophélie and Daniel. So, after this very brief entr'acte, for the second act, I welcome on the stage Ophélie Coelho as well as Daniel Mügge. Thank you both for joining us from Paris in your case, Ophélie, and from Amsterdam in the case of Daniel. Ophélie, as already mentioned, but just to be clear, is an independent researcher specializing in digital geopolitics. You're a former member of the Scientific Council at the Observatoire of Public Ethics and the Rousseau Institute, and the author of Géopolitics du numérique, l'impérialisme à pas de géant, published 2 years ago. Daniel Mügge is a professor of political arithmetic at the University of Amsterdam, and his work focuses on how the EU governs AI, and also how these policies are shaped by global economic and geopolitical rivalries. And with you both, we hope to have some further perspectives on these discussions, which we have started discussing with Bruno. Between the lines, it was clear that sovereignty is a key concept in Bruno's thinking. And tax sovereignty is also something that interests you. It's another term, just like geopolitics, which has entered the Brussels vocabulary recently. We now, I hadn't realized that we now even have EU Commissioner for Tech Sovereignty, Security and Democracy, Hanna Virkkunen from Finland. So we thought it would be useful to also zoom in now a little bit more also on this technological side of the broad sovereignty and world building discussion we just had, and maybe just start by trying to make sense of this. What does it actually mean, tech sovereignty, for you, Ophélie?
Okay. So for me, tech sovereignty is kind of an elusive concept. In fact, especially when you speak about digital realm, you can't really speak about sovereignty as an absolute concept, because in fact, no country was never sovereign on digital technologies. Even the United States, if we speak about them, from the beginning, they were always dependent on another country. For example, in the 80s, they were dependent for semiconductor on Japanese companies, and then after that on Taiwan and Korea too. So never, no country, even the great empires of digital technologies, were never sovereign. In my book and my work in general, I prefer to speak about a dependency approach to power. So it means that we'll speak more about dependency management, in fact, and how we can use technologies as power leverages, in fact, to be able to influence and impact international relations. And so that's it. For me, to speak about tech sovereignty does not have really sense at the end.
Because you see it in terms of these dependencies, dependency management, but
yes.
So is that close to de-risking kind of approach and risk assessment? And
yes, it is about risk management. And it is also to conceive, in fact, technologies as leverages to impact political sovereignty. And so as we see now, for example, United States are using, it's not just now, before they already did that, they are using all their power leverages to impact, to influence European countries' sovereignty. And so for digital technologies, it's the same. And it's just that. And so when we speak about
so for the US, what do you think about in particular?
Yes. For example, when they want to weaken the European regulation on technologies, when they try to negotiate about energy, selling, for example, GNL to Europe and all that, every dependence is a point, a level to negotiate, and especially during a crisis or a war, right, as we are now. And so, and it is also, we have also to say that all those digital technologies are built to be interdependent. And they also emerge during a specific historical moment where globalization helped, in fact, to build this worldwide network, in fact, and also with this economical ideology that made it possible to to have this big tech emerging that become private empires that also work on building those dependencies now. That's where their power just rely on. In fact, the big tech just build dependencies to have to get power right now.
And how, looking at Europe in particular, because most of that big tech is US big tech.
Yes.
In your view, how can European states or European Union respond to that? Or because even if it's a relative term, tech sovereignty, I presume you want as much as possible of it, in terms of your agency that it creates. What for you would be the priorities to focus on?
The first step would be to have a plan, a kind of program, to make a huge technological transition, right? But to make that, we have first to shift from a business-first idea to a societal idea, and to, in fact, target sectors that are important for the society. So, the health, education, media, administration, security, energy, to begin with. When we target that, we can also make some study about what we really use as technological components. For example, just precisely when we use Amazon Web Services as developers, we don't use all the cloud library. We just use something like 5, 10 components. And we can do it in Europe, in fact. We have the technological competence, knowledge to use that, to do that. So we really have to thread the needle to be really specific and to build this strategy to to win back power on those specific technological components, beginning with what we use daily, in fact, as citizens. And that's, I think, what we are really far to think of right now, because we always think about the market. So, for example, we always have this opinion that that it would be good to have a European champion, a European big tech. But do we really want to have big tech conglomerates in Europe? I think it's on the contrary. We have to do the contrary in Europe, in fact. We have to make a digital serving society first, in fact. And so to do that, we can use what is specific for digital, is that for software, it is decentralized by nature. And in Europe, the good thing is that we have SMEs network, a big SMEs network that can build together or work together on the same software base, in fact. When we speak about open source, we can, in fact, work on the same base, work on platform together, and make SMEs sell this solution to school, administration, and all that, right? It can work, in fact. But we have to target all that and to be really specific on this shift. So it's not about to have money, to make money, and to make money for investors. It's to serve societies. And this is the first shift. Just a last word about this tech sovereignty thing. I also think that sovereignty right now, when we have nationalism and far right growing in Europe, could also be instrumentalized by far right. We have this in France, in fact, far right using digital sovereignty in their political agenda. And so this is also another argument for me to avoid the term.
Thank you, Ophélie. Turning now to Daniel, I think some of your work resonates around the same theme of empowering also civic society in the digital sphere. But what is, taking up the same question, what is your take on tech sovereignty? Do you think it's worth striving for, or it's overrated, and what should replace it if we don't want it?
To my mind, there are two key reasons why I think tech sovereignty is something to strive for. The first one is to avoid the possibility of blackmail, something that Bruno mentioned. The second one is that the kind of digitization that we've seen here in Europe, dominated by foreign companies, but is essentially an extractive one. The economic fortunes of these countries and of these companies that dominate our digital sphere are essentially extractive business models that build on monopolies, oligopolies, lock-in, choke points, these sorts of things. And that's, in general, as Ophélie said, whether they're American or Chinese or European, that's a business model that doesn't serve other companies, it doesn't serve the citizens, so getting away from that is useful. The other reason why I think tech sovereignty is important, and this relates, Luc, indeed, to what you just mentioned, is that we need a different kind of digitization such that we put broader public policy objectives more central. Exactly as Ophélie said, right now the digitization that we see is dominated essentially by profit motives, and that's antithetical to the kinds of things that we want to see. You mentioned health, you mentioned education. What that means essentially is we need not only to get away from foreign companies, but we need to get away from the model of digitization that we see proposed both by the United States and by China. Why? Because it's bad for societal coherence. Why? Because it creates too many losers in our society. Why? Because it alienates people in their daily lives. Why? Because it's ecologically unsustainable. And there's not just a question of do-gooder values, but I think the kinds of digitizations that we see here is something that eats away at the social fabric that we have in Europe. I think it fosters anti-democratic tendencies. It fosters alienations among the people who are less off in our societies, feeding political extremism. So if we want to keep European societies and thereby the European project together, we need a different kind of digitization that we have. And that's an additional reason why we need to get away from a model that's basically built on maximum value extraction. And again, whether that's American companies or other ones. And finally, Bruno, you mentioned this already, I also have serious problems with the whole Draghi approach. There is a thinking that's in the Draghi report and then the way that it has diffused here in the city that sees us locked in a competition. It's always about competition, competitiveness. And to be honest, the way that American companies in the United States and Chinese companies in Beijing are playing this game right now, namely willing to feed into the oligopolistic, monopolistic business models of these companies, if that's the race that has to be run, I don't think we should be running that race. That's a business model that's being used that we don't want here in Europe, and so ex ante, we'll always lose that race unless we basically sell our soul to the devil, which we shouldn't do. So get away from that race logic. I think what we need is a kind of digital self-determination. We need to be able to regain a modicum of control over what happens within our borders. No, we won't be world builders in the short term. On that front, we won't compete with the Americans or with the Chinese, however that's going to play out. But being able to carve out a niche where we can preserve and continue to build the world that's valuable for European citizens, that for me is the key goal of tech sovereignty.
Sounds good, but how, I mean, there again, what are the most concrete steps we can go a little bit further into that as well in the course of our conversation, but maybe you can mention one or two.
Oh, absolutely. This city right now is abuzz with the term Eurostack. Many of you will have come across it. Different versions of that concept have been around. If you read, I highly suggest reading Ophélie's book, super cool, so far only available in French, but still highly readable. In your final chapter, I feel you have sort of like a to-do list for Brussels that to me reads very much like Eurostack avant la lettre, I feel. So this is about identifying crucial infrastructural choke points that we have, whether it's about indeed communications infrastructure, submarine cables were mentioned, for example. French companies are actually sort of doing okay on that, but reclaiming sovereignty over those. Enabling, systematically promoting citizen choice when it comes to alternative software applications, for example, enforcing these sorts of things. I don't think that we need hyperscalers, so large AI data centers on the same scale that they have them in the US, because 80% of the kind of AI that's developed and deployed there is not socially useful. I would say, let's focus on the 20%, whether it's in health diagnostics, improving logistics, all these sorts of things that we really need, then invest 20% of the money that the US invests, but in the right kinds of things, and forget about what Facebook or Meta does. That is an extractive business model that's basically boosting their ad tech and manipulation capabilities. The fact that we don't have that, nobody should lose sleep over that. We don't need that kind of stuff. Like, we're better off not having it, truth be told. So identifying choke points, getting rid of them. I do agree with both Bruno and Ophélie that we need a fundamental mind shift here. I mean, like this, the EU wasn't built for bold action. It was built to keep national capitals happy and help them coordinate things. I mean, many of you in the room will be much better familiar with that story. We do need bold action right now, and it has to be European. Otherwise, we don't get the scale, and also we're intermeshed in a legal web that doesn't allow countries to do complete their own thing right now. So the one thing that I keep hearing when I talk to people here in Brussels about what needs to happen is leadership. This needs to be Chefsache. And you mentioned the Paris AI Summit. I felt that right after that, was only a few weeks ago, there was really a buzz where Ursula von der Leyen and others that seemed to be in their top 3 priority list, getting European tech off the ground. And then I felt that just 2 weeks later, all of a sudden it was all defense and nobody talked about AI or tech or anything anymore. All the money that was 5 minutes before pledged for getting European tech off the ground was now going to Rheinmetall and Helsing and others. So if I have one worry right now...
It was 2 days. Defense spoke in Paris on Wednesday at the AI summit, and on Friday he spoke in Munich, opening that other ideological front against Europe and Ukraine. So it was 2 days.
Yeah. So final thing, what to do? Use the levers that you have much more boldly. Things like public procurement, things like using security clauses to say, you don't want Chinese tech, well, we don't want other tech because it's security vulnerability. I feel that the Europeans are the only ones left in the room who still feel obliged to play by the rules, whereas everybody else, has long taken their gloves off. That's unfortunate. I don't want to live in that world, but we do live in that world, so I don't quite understand why we still talk about, we need to win in the marketplace, be competitive. Nobody else cares about being competitive. This is governments using all the force they have to push their big tech version down the throat of the rest of the world. Why do we think we need to win this in the marketplace? I think that's yesterday's thinking.
And that's what you think is wrong with the whole competitiveness?
Completely. Like, if we talk about geo-economic competition, the gloves off version, yes, but if we think about that, winning the tech race is about having a better product at a better price point. That moment is long gone, if it has ever been there, as you show in your book.
Well, if you look at the Draghi report, it's a misnomer. It has competitiveness on the title, but a lot of the things he writes in the report are about actually industrial policy, which doesn't say its name. So,
True.
Maybe too subtle, but some of the action is there. Maybe Bruno, turning to you on this. Any thoughts on this?
A quick comment. So this idea of digital sovereignty, I think, is extremely powerful in the US and China. By the way, I advise you to see the photos first of Donald Trump's inauguration with Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and perhaps a couple others sitting behind him. The digital political military complex in all its glory, but not hidden anymore, very visible. And then see the pictures of Xi Jinping meeting all the tech CEOs, including the CEO of DeepSeek about 2 weeks ago. Everyone smiling, everyone very happy, everyone looking like a team, which should be scary for people in the West. They are committed to winning this. Then in Europe, my two partners today, I think, represent a different view from this view that I just described. And sometimes, when I'm sitting in a cafe in Nairobi or Jakarta, I'm like, see a European walk by or sitting in a cafe, and I actually ask myself, and you must ask yourself this as well, what exactly do I have in common with this person? What makes us European? And in the end, I think it's one thing that came through in your comments. That there's a very strong strain of anarchism for Europeans. Let's be honest. We are, and this goes back centuries.
I'm glad you picked that up. I dressed up with suit and tie, that it still shines through.
Still shines.
You're from Amsterdam.
Maybe that's what it is.
There are different kinds of anarchism. But, the suspicion about the idea of tech sovereignty, particularly because we all know that tech sovereignty is going to turn into the two photos that I just described. I think Ophélie mentioned this notion that society should come first. And I think before the state and before the economy, and these technologies should serve not the economy and not the state, but primarily society, which I think is a very distinctively European idea. Now, I don't want to say we should abandon these things, because again, this is what, in fact, I think in the end justifies something like the European Union, is this civilizational core that we share very fundamental ideas about how to organize society in the world. But, we also have to rethink a number of things. As I said in my initial comments, I think it was a tragic mistake to think either because we had a naive view of American companies, or because we thought that we'd be able to regulate them, or because we thought we shouldn't even be in that game. We just allowed our internet economy to be dominated by 5 American companies. And now to say we did that because the European entrepreneur is less agile than the American entrepreneur is something that drives me crazy. furious. But this is an idea you hear in Silicon Valley. But it was not because of that. It's because we left an open field to these companies. We didn't understand or didn't want to understand that there were very powerful network effects, that with something like Facebook, you're not going to have a competitor 2 years later when Facebook already has 4 billion users. It's not easy to get to 4 billion users as a startup. And so we should have been much more careful. By the way, network effects when it comes to AI are going to be even more powerful than the internet economy. So let's be careful about that. And without going too long into what the solution should be, because I also don't know what it should be, I do think, ideally, we would have our internet giants and then regulate them differently from what the US and China do. But the idea that we are not going to have those internet giants and then we are going to regulate Facebook, I've worked as a consultant too, and I know that's not going to happen. We're not going to regulate Facebook, but if we had our own digital economy, then we could regulate it. So the mistake was to think that we didn't have to also compete at the level of having large, powerful companies.
So you're saying that we need strong companies, a bit unlike Ophélie, who says the SME approach to the digital industrial sphere could also work, but you're saying strong companies and a strong state, which could then ensure that the values we Europeans, as we sit here, care about can be some relatively speaking.
I look forward to reading Ophélie's book, but that was the moment in her comments that I found myself disagreeing more. Sure.
Well, that's why it's good to have these debates. I think it would be perhaps nice to get some more of these ideas of also on your to-do list, Ophélie, out, because in a way as Bruno said, things are moving rapidly. Germany seems ready to invest indeed 1 week in technology, next week in defense, but still there will be massive investment coming from Germany, which will also benefit the digital technology. In France, they're all excited also about successes in the AI economy with Mistral and the summit. In Poland, I checked, there was last year $500 million of investment in AI startups as well. So there's a lot going on. Whatever you say of the Draghi report, but it is consensual now in this town that there is a big boost on innovation is necessary. There is also, I would say, on the side of European, maybe civil society, a feeling of enough of US big tech. I don't know how widespread that is, but I mean, we can have all debates about the number of people having or not having left X or WhatsApp and all of that, but there is a kind of energy, at least in some circles, of that there's a moment of truth there for Europe to step up its game. And you, Ophélie, and Daniel as well, you have already started laying out some ideas, basically, but as we are here in a room also filled with policymakers and people in the Brussels community, thinking about EU legislators and EU leaders, how should they orient in the months ahead on the map this work, what initiatives should get priority, and who should take the ball and get it rolling.
Yes.
Maybe just one or two. Your one or two favorites, let's say.
Of course. It's difficult because it depends on sector, on the industry, right? But I think we have to choose offensive and defensive. Mm-hmm. So what I talked before about society-driven technology is the protection, defensive one. Mm-hmm. So it's autonomous strategy. And on the offensive...
But what are we going to do defensive?
Yes, as defensive. So as defensive, as I said just before, I think we can rely on smaller companies, mm-hmm. right? That will not follow, in fact, the same data economy that would do, in fact, a European big tech. What is the risk by choosing the European champion, so investment in a big company that would be put on the market and with big investors and would be and that would become a multinational, all that. In fact, it would lead automatically to data economy, and it would lead to the same mechanism that we know now.
And just to pick you up on Bruno's point, do you not think that that the risks inherent in that growth of bigger companies could be offset by strong regulation or strong
yes, in
state
fact,
actors?
having European actors is always better. So it's always better to regulate them, but it does not change the technological model. We always think, so from the beginning of the 2000 and now since 10 nearly 20 years, we always follow this thought that digital is also about data. But in fact, we have to make it as a tool to serve society. You know, there are different visions. Data economy is to make money. So if you want to make a European big tech to make money and to make dependency on others, okay, work on dependency. That is the offensive way. And you can regulate them in Europe, okay. But if you want to protect your society, don't choose this way. It's not the good one.
So that's on the defensive side.
Yes.
And on the offensive? Or
So on the offensive, I think, so we can eventually go to the scenario of European champion, but in my way we can also do something else that would be maybe better for Europe, is to target dependency nodes. In fact, we always speak about value chain, you know, it is an economic concept. But I prefer to speak about dependency chain where you have nodes concentrating powers. And we have to target those nodes. For example, I speak sometimes about the undersea cable industry. Now you have US big tech that are really powerful in this industry. Since 10 years they invest a lot, and now you have Google owning 32 cables that are big cables, and he has the capacity to be the sole owner of 16 cable that is really new in this industry. From all the history, from telegraphic cable, it was never bad. So
investing
what we can do,
European cables.
So if we can't invest in the production in the ownership of those cables, we can, in fact, be on the dependency chain. For example, in France, we have Alcatel submarine network where the state invested last year. Okay, we lost it, Alcatel submarine network as a company, but the French state chose to invest more in this company, so it can have the power to decide also the direction of this company. And ASN is a producer of cable, you know, it is about fabric. And the other point would be la flotte de navires câbliers. So I don't know how we say this in English.
The naval...
Naval, yes, naval, la flotte de navires câbliers. So that are the boats that just pose the cable, you know, in the sea, right? We have companies in France like Orange Marine, for example. Those are nodal actors.
Right.
For example, we can invest in. By by having those nodes, we are able to negotiate and to influence the dependency chain. And I think we can do that in all the technology, the tech industry.
So be smart in choosing some of your levers.
Thread the needle,
for
be meticulous and all that.
Yeah. So that's a very nice offensive point to work on. I'm from the Netherlands, and there the undersea business is mostly about dragging mud, but this seems a much smarter part of the business in the water, indeed.
Look,
Daniel,
if there are 2 points that I can add,
yes.
I think there's a misunderstanding in the city that the most flashy AI is the economically most promising AI. People were completely captivated by generative AI, so large language models, ChatGPT, all this sort of stuff. The really big business case for that this is going to be sort of like a gold dust icing that will be sparkled over the whole society and economy and it's going to lift everybody up, is for me really still an open question. I think just today or yesterday there was yet again an article in the Financial Times that when you survey workers, desk workers, whether they're using Gen AI, whether it's Copilot in their office or something, they at best play around with it, but they really don't know what exactly they should do with it. They write their emails a bit faster, maybe. But many of the economically really promising applications of this are, for example, I think in robotics, are in things that have to do with improving logistics. And these are applications that don't require a massive model with billions of parameters that's trained in a data center the size of 3 football fields, but that's something that Siemens can do very well in-house. So this fixation on open AI, and that's where the future lies, and we don't have something like that, we're basically screwed, is I think fundamentally misleading. The reason why the American economy has been performing so well over the past years and has outperformed Europeans, I think Bruno mentioned it already, is almost exclusively due to the Magnificent Seven. Like, take them out of the US stock market and you don't really see a whole lot of action. And the business model that they've been operating on has been integrating different layers of the stack, so the cloud, the search and mailing services, data acquisition, investing into energy, into these cables, these sorts of things. Now, that gives you a source of super profits, if you will, that makes these companies extremely rich and extremely large. Doesn't mean that you can't basically take these different layers apart again, have one company doing the cables, have another one providing the email system, have yet another one providing the search, have yet another one providing the cloud services. Not as profitable, hence not as big if you look at the stock market, but it doesn't mean that the technological capabilities that we have available here in Europe wouldn't be exactly the same. So this whole idea, I think there has to be, I think you can be agnostic about these questions.
So you please stop your obsession with generative AI. And
yes, that I think is a potential
robotics and
these
also
things,
including with investment.
Well, see, because the thing there is, like, as I said, like, you don't need an open AI in order to upgrade Siemens production processes. You know, that's the German in me. You come with the French companies, I come with the Germans. And I think that's true for many of these applications. If you take a deep breath and think about, okay, just ask around, ask CEOs of non-tech companies, where do you really think that you could use broadly conceived more tech, whether you call it AI or something else? Where would it really push you forward? I don't think that most of them, they wouldn't say, oh, I need a better co-pilot in my MS Teams. That's not what's going to make the difference. No, they say, well, you know, I'm producing X, Y, I'm making car tires. I need a better algorithm, computer vision with a learning system to detect potential production faults in my car tires so that I need to throw fewer of them away. Stuff like that. And that doesn't require this, you know, flashy big tech stuff. So get away from that obsession, take a deep breath, build on the strength that we have here. As Bruno said, innovation capacity is big in Europe. So keep calm and carry on and focus on the stuff that's really worthwhile and important, also economically.
Yeah. Bruno?
I don't have a lot more to say. I think I've spoken too much. I don't know if you want to...
No, I think it's also a moment to open up to the floor. I think we could take 2, 3... let's start with 3 questions and then we can see whether there's time for more or not. Who wants to... I see many hands raised here. Lady over there. If you can just mention your name. Then
sure. Hi, I'm Sabine Muscat. I'm an independent consultant in Brussels on international digital policy issues, and I very much how you described sovereignty and anchoring it to the citizen and the communities very much resonated with me. But my question is actually going back to the very beginning of the conversation that you had. It goes to Bruno first, I think, but for the others as well. When you were asked, who are the world builders? You said, of course, they're the states. I think a few years ago, we would have probably come up with the companies as well. And those companies, those big global corporations, for sure, saw themselves as world builders. And I mean, if you look at the influence, the thinkers that influenced the tech corporates, leaders like Balaji Srinivasan and people like that of the network state, they were dreaming of a borderless virtual state and creating something like that. So then, in some ways, this has gone back to bite them, if you will, because at some point they were in China, they were told Xi Jinping is the boss, and in the US there was more mistrust, and people were starting to try to regulate them. However, Trump seems to have given them like all the leeway that they can have, like sending them out and not having regulation, but now they're being relegated by the resistance from others to being American companies, and that is hurting them right now.
So
but
your
what is
question, sum up is...
the question is really, sorry, it's too long, but the question really is like, how do you see, under what circumstances can private corporations be world builders? And how are we seeing this now, and how has that perhaps shifted?
Can they still be? Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Maybe we take two more questions, and then you can pick and choose. Gentleman on the side.
Thank you. I'm Hosheng. I'm working Euroelectric, but the question is regardless of my organization, because I used to work for semiconductor industry in South Korea, and I was a intelligence military officer. So my question is, and people going to question about this kind of node technology as a previous semiconductor worker, Europe is doing well. ASML is like a dominance. Like without ASML, even Korea cannot build this kind of semiconductor chips. And secondly, in France, there's a name. The company name is GTT. They have a technology in the gas tank for the LNG. All the LNG ship is built by Korean company. We cannot build this ship without the French company. So in that sense, Europe is doing well.
And now your question.
Yeah, my question is, sorry. So, as I mentioned, like we cannot deny that like China has become like a important state and become a world builder. But what I'm facing in what my country is facing right now is like a xenophobia. This kind of xenophobia sometimes hinders people to understand this kind of the changing orders. Like it sometimes leads this kind of misunderstood toward China. So how Europe can to prevent this kind of misunderstanding things to the xenophobia? That is my question. Thank you.
Thank you. I take final question. Maybe gentleman here. Yes.
Okay. Hello, my name is Maurizio, and I'm from the University of Ghent. Ghent. This question is for Bruno. I haven't read your book, but I'm looking forward to reading it. But the question I have is that you're talking about world builders, and then let's say the American century was built as much as technology and economic domains as well as ideas. So what is the idea that you think China has to be a world builder? Because of course they have the economic power, they have the military power, AI and so on, but what is the idea that will, let's say, spread to the rest of the world, or the rest of the world will absorb?
Thank you. Let's take it from there if you want.
Yeah,
Bruno,
I'll be quick. I'll be quick.
China-related questions.
Yeah, apologize for having brief responses, but I want to leave space for other people. So you know that Xi Jinping asked Joe Biden when they met, still as vice presidents, if you want to summarize America in one word, what would it be? And Joe Biden responded, I think rather well, possibilities. And unfortunately, Joe Biden didn't have the mental agility to ask in return how would summarize China in one word. But so if I take the opportunity to try to do that instead of Xi Jinping, which would be maybe the most interesting answer, I think it would be something like government. The role of collective agency as organizing the whole of society towards a certain direction. Not fully predetermined, but still in the infinite realm of possibilities to move society in a certain collective direction. And this obviously is something that has its roots in Chinese history, but not a coincidence that China was attracted by Marxist thought, because I think within European thought this is where you found this idea most clearly expressed. And Xi Jinping himself talks a lot about this. So, I think if we had a Chinese world, it would be a world organized around the idea of government.
And would that be appealing for non-Chinese? I think that's also the question of the gentleman. That principle,
I
that
think,
value.
I think you would have appealing elements and elements that would not be appealing. But I think that's true in general. I suspect that what will happen, people may disagree with this, I suspect China will soften considerably in my lifetime still. My general philosophy of history is that powers tend to be more magnanimous and more tolerant when they are more powerful. Akbar, Mughal emperor in India, was an example of a very magnanimous ruler, tolerant to all religions. Why? Because the Mughal Empire was at the height of its power. So I think as China increases in power, we are not going to see a more repressive China. I think we're going to see a less repressive China. And it wouldn't surprise me if 20 years from now the firewall has been considerably removed. Maybe you'll have a Chinese leader that will speak English and be rather charming as opposed to Xi Jinping. I don't know if there's anyone from the Chinese embassy. So these things change. And so we shouldn't, it's also an answer to your xenophobia question. I suspect a lot of it will go away, but we'll see. And then quickly on the state and companies. I actually discussed this a lot with Balaji back in 2018. He used to say that the state has no power over us because we work with encrypted keys for our crypto and our DeFi, and the state cannot break the encryption. And I used to argue to him, not being a crypto specialist, that I used to argue, well, the state can just go after you and put you in jail, and perhaps can even torture you to get your key. And I think in the end, these people understood that, and what I see is that trying to take over the state, not Balaji specifically, but certainly Musk. Musk is trying to take over the American state. Now, if you thought companies were replacing the state, he wouldn't do that. He would stay in his companies and wait for the companies to empty or replace the state or supersede the state. But my answer to you is, well, Musk, who is at the center of these processes, seems to think that the state is in charge and seems to think that the next stage in his life is to take over the American state rather than to build more companies.
Ophélie, maybe on that question of relation state companies, or Daniel, if you want to...
Go ahead.
Yes, about that. I think, in fact, we can consider state empires and private empires as using different leverage of power. But at the end, they have the same wish to objective of goal to expand and to use their influence on politics and on societies. Musk is is a specific character, but in fact, in his hands, so he uses Trump to access power. But when you see about a technological actor, he's not a big actor. Okay, he has SpaceX. Okay, this is something. But Neuralink, Tesla, and what he do and robotics, it's not really something that is global or used by a lot of persons. It's not massive, right? I think more about this kind of power and private empires. I think more about Alphabet, for example, or Microsoft, or even in a way a little bit Meta, that are for me much more powerful and discreet, in fact, than Musk on the tech industry in reality. And I know that media are not do not agree about this, but okay. And so I think, yes, they have a lot of power. You can't compare them to states, but they use states, in fact. They use state with public investments. They use state also when it goes to a crisis. They are the first beneficiary of those crises. And so for me, we have to take care about that. Private empires like big tech are multinational, are on the multinational and global scale, right? And we do not have the same kind of entity on the international scale for states. We have international organization, of course, and all that, but that does not really work when it goes to international regulation or to manage some really important subjects on ecology or energy management or all that. So, so for me, it is really something we have to take care of.
So you still think that the companies have more power than maybe we think, because some of it is invisible, as it were,
yes,
and the state power is more visible.
Not the same
thinking
power.
also about Bruno's photos there.
Yes, it's not the same goal, it's not the same power, you know. So for me, it would be wrong to say that we can compare exactly the two actors, right? Those private actors that are big tech or big oil or big pharma, right? First, those are they have some similarities. Big tech is a bit special about that because they are multi-sectoral and doing something really transversal by their activity. So it's something a little bit different than big pharma, for example, or big oil. And it is also about software, that you can, in fact, software, you can produce it anywhere. Even if you go with the army on a data center, there is another data center that has it in another country, so you can't touch it as a state. And this is about this global scale that we have to think about when we think about private empires like big tech.
Thank you. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. No, that's very interesting also, this difference between big tech and big pharma and big oil.
Yes,
I think
so it's not a war
helpful.
between state and big tech.
Well, just two very short thoughts. The first one is, I think we tend to underestimate the contingency in all of this. I'm very sympathetic, also intellectually, to the big picture thinking that Bruno has laid out. At the same time, I think if you think back through the past 10 years, at different junctures, US elections, for example, certainly the first time Trump was elected to office, it wouldn't have taken much and the coin would have fallen the other way. We might have been a completely different place. And I think there are quite a few things here where I think history is a combination of big arcs, but also small arcs, and at critical points it could go different ways. And I think that goes to your question about how China fits into this and whether it has something appealing to offer. I think many countries that opt for China do so, A, because they like what it offers more than what the others offer, namely something that simply has fewer strings attached in certain kinds of ways, and we'll worry about the debts that we build up later. And the other thing is that I think, say, countries in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, that are willing to attract Chinese investment for infrastructure and these sorts of things, I'm not sure how far they think ahead. I mean, as is true for any politician, really, right? That's not specific to these governments. But I think there is a lot of stumbling forward that in the end emerges into a bigger picture, but doesn't necessarily speak to some huge grand project or something. And there I feel sometimes, who knows, as you said, like who knows where Ukraine will be half a year from now? Who knows where Gaza will be a year from now? Who knows where Taiwan will be 2 years from now? Who knows whether the next big thing is going to be a massive large language model, or whether we'll actually have things that work pretty well that we can download on our AI computers, and it's all going to run on edge computing, and nobody needs all these data centers anymore. To be honest, like, we've been surprised so many times that I feel that there is it's easy to overestimate, these very big arcs, technologically, historically, politically, and underestimate the contingency we face politically, economically, and technologically.
Well, thank you. I think these are very also good closing words, coming back, coming full circle, as it were, with also Bruno's idea of a history that is open, provided we bring the agency, which all three of our panelists have pleaded for in their own way. Maybe there are people who were very eager to ask questions, but I see it's a few minutes past 7, and I do have a solution for you, which is that we have a cocktail going on, that our esteemed guests will be with us, so maybe they will be happy to answer further questions there. Bruno will maybe sign his book, which as
You'll have
mentioned,
to.
is on purchase. Thank
part
you
of the
all three for this fascinating conversation, for sharing these insights with us at this timely moment. Thank you all for being with us here at this place for strategic discussions. We hope to have many more in the future with you and with all of us. Thank you.